Welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be talking about how to build a financial strategy that supports your mission instead of hindering it. Now it is a new year, and so I'm sure many of you are thinking about how this year is going to go. You're thinking about ways that you can make sure that you set a good financial foundation, and so this video is going to help support that. So if that's your goal, stick around. Now the reality is that you can have all of the programs, you can have the vision, the community, the members for your organization to take off, but if your financial strategy is weak, if things are a bit disorganized or reactive, your mission and its impact will always be capped. And so what we're gonna be talking about are ways to make sure that that does not happen. Let's talk about what it looks like to build a financial strategy that uplifts and supports the mission, helps to stabilize the organization, and helps you to grow without chaos. If you're not new here, then you know I typically have my handy dandy notebook, which is my laptop, but today I have upgraded. And so if you see me look down, that's what this is, okay? Before we dive into the details, let's talk a little bit about the mistake that's often made. So typically, I find that when we first start working with organizations, a lot of times they come to us with no strategy. There's sometimes a half approved board budget. They're trying to get funding from different areas. Money's going out because of expenses, but very little time is spent setting a plan for how you're going to do what it is that you need to do to be successful in the year, right? Because typically your strategy and your budget go hand in hand, but a lot of times not enough emphasis is placed on setting the stage for the year, right? So sometimes you're operating based off of, when this grant comes in, I'm gonna do X, or let's spend based off of what's in the bank today, maybe not taking into account that you have some things that are going to be coming up, meaning like expenses. You know, we'll save that for when the auditor comes in. And honestly, not a good plan, right? It really isn't a plan at all. It really is more so operating out of survival mode and kind of in a day-to-day type of reactive way versus being proactive and thinking out long term. And when I say long term, I'm not saying you have to have this 5-year plan, because we know things are changing rapidly. However, if you're starting the year and you're not sure what your plans are for this year, or you don't know what's going to even be happening next month or this quarter, I'm talking about near future, right? Those are the things that we want to be talking about. And so we want you to kind of get out of that reactive mode and start leading. There are 5 components that I'm going to be talking about, and it is my belief that when these things are aligned, everything else becomes easier. So let's get started. The first thing is going to be a clear funding model. One of the first questions I ask whenever I'm on a discovery call, and what that is just getting to know an organization that's interested in working with visionary, is how are you funded? Is it individual donations? Is it grants, government grants, sponsorships? How are you funded, and what's the mix, right? Because typically you might be funded in one or more ways. And so we like to know what that mix is, because also the way that you are funded kind of drives how we manage your finances. And so it's a question that sometimes seems so like, what do you mean? But it really is important, right? And so when you think about it, a clear funding model is going to answer the question of, like, where's your money coming from in this next 1 to 2 years, right? Even if we're thinking about near future, where's your money coming from this year? So when you look at your budget and you're looking at that income portion, have you clearly indicated where the income is going to be coming from? That's important. What you'll need clarity on is the type of funding that you're expecting to come in, how much, and the likelihood. I think we miss out on the likelihood, and so sometimes we get these plans that are very vision-based or very hopeful and would be great. It would be great. However, if the likelihood is low, then we're kind of operating on a wing and a prayer, and we don't want to do that, right? And so we want to make sure you have a clear funding model, you have assessed the likelihood, and you are moving forward with things that seem highly likely. And when I say things, I mean funding that is highly likely, right? A strategic nonprofit is going to make sure that they have assessed this, right? And they're going to make sure that they know how to assess likelihood. So if a funder is telling you that they are going to give you a certain amount of dollars, What's the likelihood that that's going to actually happen? Have they given you a grant agreement, or is it just this promise, but you've seen no action? I know some organizations have a scale, and so there are things that they look for that helps them to assess, is this likely or not? That is something that you should be implementing, and that is something you should be using whenever there's this so-called like promise to pay is what we call them. Now, the second component, now that you've clearly laid out your funding models, are going to be your cost structure and your true program costs. This is something that often we see, you might know one, not the other. And this is something, if you've set it up appropriately in your accounting tool, that you can track on a consistent basis. And so if you haven't, you might want to check out one of my other videos where I talk about the features in QuickBooks Online and how you can use it to track your program costs. But for the sake of this video, when we're talking about cost structure and your true program costs, a lot of times I see that organizations are underpricing themselves because they don't understand what their programs really cost. And so when I get a budget, I'm seeing all of the organization's expenses. But if I say, okay, you run 3 programs, how much does it cost to run program A versus program C? A lot of times we're met with unanswered questions, right? And so it's very important that you know that, because when you're thinking about component 1 and you're thinking of that funding needs to be able to cover your organizational and programmatic costs. But if you don't know what that number truly is, or a very good estimate, you could potentially be bringing in funding that doesn't cover your organization's true expenses, right? So then you end up being left with this deficit, and that is what we want to avoid. Now, I'm not gonna go into all of the details of every single expense that you need to track, but I'm gonna mention a few because these are like most important. But essentially, if it is a cost, you should know an estimate about how much it is and whether or not it is tied to organizational or programmatic. So we're talking things like your staff salaries and fringe, program supplies, if you have any sort of facility. I know a lot of you are operating remotely, but there are still organizations out there that have offices. We have clients that, even though the staff may sometimes work remote, they have facilities where the community gets to use those facilities. And so it's important to know, what does it cost to keep those facilities open, right? So you want to think about that. Technology, your indirect overhead expenses. What does it take, or how much does it cost for you to be compliant? Many of you might have hit the threshold where you have to be audited. You have to make sure that you know how much it's going to cost. Quick little caveat here, audits have gone up. Things have become a bit more strict, more stringent, and so the price of audits have gone up. And so you want to make sure that you're aware of that and you are accounting for those things. And your data tracking. A huge part of that is making sure that your financials are rock solid. And that means that your accounting system has to be set up in a way that provide you with the data that you need. You need to know whether you have assessed these things. And when we're thinking about true program costs, a portion of these do touch your programs. And so you should know, how much does program A pay for our audit? How much do we allocate there? Because program A requires actually that we get an audit, which means it's not 100% an organizational cost, right? And so these are typically conversations that you have to have with your finance director, right, with your accounting team, because typically you may not know these answers off the top of your head, but your accounting team should. And so that's why this is a collaborative effort. Now, the third component is on cash flow projection and scenario planning. And there is a video on my channel where I talk about that. So if you need the details, you can check that video out. But for the sake of this video, I'm just mentioning that as part of setting your organization's financial strategy for the year, you should be thinking about cash flow and you should be scenario planning. Now we have some data, right? So when we think about what happened during the pandemic, or when we think about what happened just last year where, funds were frozen at the federal level, we know that there is a strong possibility that these things could happen. And so we should be planning for these scenarios. We should be having open discussions between management, the board, and finance about, if these things happen, what do we do? If this, then what? That's what they used to teach us when I used to take auditing in college. It's like, if this, then what? You have to know that if these things happen, what will you do? So some people are looking at it on a monthly basis. I actually like to peel back, and instead of a monthly cash flow, do a rolling weekly. So 12 weeks, so projecting out, because sometimes we're thinking 12 months out when we really need to keep a closer look on cash. So we're looking at 12 weeks and we're updating weekly, right? So we're looking and we're checking that bank balance. We're seeing what's coming out. We're anticipating what's going to come out next week, the week after. And so we're keeping it rolling. And in that same spreadsheet, we're thinking through scenario planning, right? If this funder who seems likely, but they were a little iffy, if they pulled out, what would that mean? If we had to cut back on expenses, which expenses would we cut? You know, I talked about a noodle budget where if you had to pull back, what does it look like to only cover your absolute important, essential expenses? You should know what those are. You should be prepared in advance so that all you have to do is pull the lever. And so these are some things to be thinking about. Our fourth component is around reserves, right? So operating reserves coupled with some sort of sustainability plan. Now, I do have a video on my channel also where I talk about how to build reserves. I know sometimes if you are in a very strict cash crunch, it might be difficult. And so we talk about what some of those tips could be to start small, right? If you have none, you get to 1 month and then you go up to 2, right? You build. But if you do have some loose cash, because let's be honest, we do have some clients that are still bringing in grants, right? And who are not struggling right now. And so if you do have some cash that is freed up, you want to make sure that you have some of that put to the side. You're putting some in reserves. And then if you still have some left over, you might want to think about what an investment plan. But if we talk about your operating reserves, we don't want the organization living paycheck to paycheck. You know how we talk about people living paycheck to paycheck? We don't want the organization living like that either. So when we're thinking about reserves and sustainability, you want to target having at a base level 3 months. So if you have nothing, that's your first goal, right? And you go a month at a time. If you have 3 months, then what does it look like for you to get to 6? You want to have a cushion. We've seen that cushions have been necessary. We have had people in this last year that have had to pull on their reserves. And so you want to make sure that you actually have some. Coupled with that those reserves, you want to have a policy that indicates when you're able to pull down on those funds, and you want that to be board approved. Thinking through that. And some just other things that kind of couple or complement this rather are a contribution to savings. Sometimes we've seen where there are board member contributions for the year get contributed to savings. And if not 100%, there's a portion, right? We've seen board designated funds. You know, if you want to think about when you are assessing that funding model, what little areas are you typically maybe seeing a little bit of money left over that you can kind of push over to those reserves? And then thinking of, many of you have grants, if they're multi-year, what does it look like to plan out that multi-year funding so that you're kind of thinking about future planning and making sure that you have a plan for those funds that have come in, because typically they're tied to some sort of compliance requirements. The fifth component is your accountability framework. And that's just another way of saying your internal control structure, your internal control framework. And that is the backbone of the work that you're doing, right? So making sure that you have appropriate segregation of duties, making sure that your workflows are documented. This also helps with just making sure people are doing their job, that you don't have waste, that you have assessed and you're appropriately spreading out capacity, having an approval process. You know, I had a discovery call yesterday where we talked about bill pay, and this particular potential client was interested in bill pay, adding bill pay to their services. And I talked them through how we do bill pay here, because we have a very streamlined approach that we follow. Also, a part of that accountability framework is just making sure that there are clear roles and responsibilities. I have probably talked on here many times about the very first nonprofit that I worked at, which that was the biggest accounting department that I've seen, even still, in a nonprofit organization, but there was so much waste happening. The roles and responsibilities were not clear. There were people doing double work. And so if you're thinking about ways to keep your organization lean, you want to make sure that there are clear roles and responsibilities, and that you're not only leaning on people, but you're also leaning on clear processes and tech. And then lastly, to kind of wrap up this last framework, is just making sure that you have some sort of compliance roadmap, a grant compliance roadmap or document. I've actually walked through our grant management process here, and I've talked about, even though that we have a set way that we manage these grants in QuickBooks Online, we also keep a spreadsheet, a grant tracker that indicates all of the important things that we can't save in QuickBooks Online, right? So certain deadlines, reports that are required, when those reports are due, and things like that. And so that's a huge part too, and you wanna make sure that you're capturing that, especially if you are mostly funded by grants. Now, we've talked through 5 components that support your organization's mission versus hinders it. But now I wanna go through kind of like a speed round / rapid fire of just some things that your organization should stop doing. It's the beginning of the year. It's some things that you can take into account, especially if you're thinking through what your financial strategy for the year needs to be. But these are some things that I didn't want you to forget. So the first is stop budgeting based only off of last year's numbers. You can't 100% trust that what happened in a previous year is going to translate over. You have to think about nuances, right? So it's good to look at comparative numbers, looking at the last 1 to 2 years, but then you also have to think about things that those numbers don't say, right? You know if you're going to be hiring, if you're going to be firing people, you know if you're going to be getting new funding, or if a funder will no longer, be renewing a grant. You know if a program is no longer going to be in operation. And so I think sometimes we just blindly just roll things over without thinking and assessing, has anything changed? Has anything been updated? So make sure that you're not solely relying on last year's numbers. Number 2, stop taking every grant that comes your way. And I know it's like, it's money, but grants come with compliance, and if you have not thought about how you're actually going to meet those compliance requirements, then you want to press pause on taking that grant. Now, if you have a way that you can meet the requirements, if you are truly aligned, right, with the stipulations around that grant, then okay. But we found that, some organizations will take on grants, they're restricted, they have a very clear way that you're supposed to spend, but sometimes that's not even in alignment with your mission. So now you're starting a new program based off of getting this funding. It's not really in alignment with the financial strategy you've designed for the year. So make sure you take a pause and not just get excited about the money, but that you determine whether or not this truly makes sense for your organization. Number 3, stop ignoring real program costs. I talked about earlier understanding true program costs, so refer back up to there, but make sure that you are tracking programmatic expenses month to month. You can't wait to the end of the year. You have to be doing it month to month. Stop waiting until the year end to close your books. You should be closing your books every single month. We give clients financials on the 15th of the month every month. Things happen, things change. People steal. Like, you have to make sure that you are looking at your books on a month-to-month basis at the very least. Stop treating accounting as an afterthought. And that's probably a good one to end on, because accountant here, right? Shameless plug. Your strategy for the year has to be supported by, do you have money? Do you have money coming in? What are you going to use to pay for the expenses that you have? And a lot of this comes from having a strong financial foundation that support your organization strategy for the year. And so accounting can't be an afterthought. You see how it kind of just doesn't align? So you have to make sure that the same way you are determining your organization's goals, what you're going to do for the year, you have to determine what money looks like, because you can't run if you don't have any money. Your mission can only go as far as your strategy takes it. It is great to have an organization whose mission you believe in. It is great to have a cause that you care about, but it has to be supported by strategy. So I hope this video was helpful. If it was, make sure you like, make sure you subscribe, and share it with someone. I know that many of you have colleagues who are probably having some of the same thoughts, questions, inquiries as you, so make sure that you share this video with someone who can benefit from it. And if you are an organization and you know that this is the year that you want to get your financials in order, you want to make sure that you are setting yourself up for success, there are 2 ways that you can work with us. 1, you can become a client. We have an open roster right now. For the time being, you can join us as a client. You can click the link in the description box, or you can join our community. If you know that you kind of have things in order and in control, but you want to be able to be in community, ask questions, be able to show up and just peek in and see what other nonprofit leaders are doing, then our Accounting for Good community could be very beneficial for you. But that's all for now. I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.